A son took his own mother to court, claiming she was mentally unfit. He thought he was about to inherit $50 million. What he didn't know was that his father had designed one final legal trap, and the moment he filed that lawsuit, he lost everything. The dry, scorching heat typical of Phoenix, Arizona, seemed to be cut off the moment one stepped past the thick glass doors of Henderson Law Office. Inside, the air was cold and still to the point that even the ticking of the wall clock sounded piercing. Angelina Brooks, 64 years old, sat small and sunken into a dark leather armchair. She wore a simple black dress, old but neatly pressed, an image that mirrored her life itself, a woman who had once been a diligent secretary accustomed to living quietly and modestly. Her thin hands were clasped tightly together, struggling to suppress their trembling. The death of her husband, Thomas Brooks, after a sudden cardiovascular illness, had not only left her with the pain of loss, but also with unspoken gaps and quiet mysteries she had never fully understood about the man she had shared more than 40 years of life with. Seated on either side of her were two opposite extremes of the Brooks family. On her left was Julia, 37 years old, a high school teacher with gentle eyes tinged with sadness. She paid no attention to the documents on the table, only silently holding her mother's hand, occasionally giving it a light squeeze in reassurance. In contrast, sitting across from them was Daniel, the eldest son, 40 years old. Dressed in an expensively tailored suit, Daniel radiated the sharpness and pragmatism of a seasoned real estate broker. His eyes were not on his mother, but fixed intently on the folder in the old lawyer's hands, filled with impatience and calculation. "To me, Mrs. Brooks, and you both," the lawyer cleared his throat, breaking the suffocating silence. "According to Mr. Thomas's wishes, I will now announce the distribution of the inheritance." Daniel raised his eyebrows, straightened his back, preparing himself to receive figures related to property or savings. "As for the cash assets and the current house, Mr. Thomas leaves joint ownership to his two children, Daniel and Julia," the lawyer read clearly. Daniel nodded slightly, though a flicker of displeasure crossed his face at having to share. "And finally," the lawyer lowered his voice and turned toward the widow, "to my wife, Angelina, I'm sorry I couldn't leave you a life of luxury. I leave you sole ownership of storage unit number 104, rented annually, located in the old industrial zone on the outskirts of the city." The room fell into absolute silence. Angelina looked up blankly, her eyes clouded with confusion. She did not even know her husband had rented a storage unit there. The silence was ripped apart by Daniel's scoffing laugh. He leaned back in his chair and tossed his pen on the cable with a sharp clack. "An empty storage unit? In the middle of nowhere?" Daniel sneered, his voice dripping with bitter sarcasm. "Dad really knew how to joke. A lifetime of hard work, and the only thing he leaves Mom is a pile of dust and monthly storage fees?" Daniel's words hit Angelina like a bucket of icy water, making her shrink further into herself, a wave of bitter humiliation rising in her chest that she could not put into words. Leaving Henderson Law Office, the blazing Arizona desert sun seemed to scorch Angelina's insides, yet she felt ice cold from within. Daniel had left immediately, claiming an important appointment, not forgetting to cast an exasperated glance back at his mother. Only Julia quietly drove her home to the familiar suburban house, a place that, legally speaking, no longer fully belonged to her. That entire afternoon, Angelina sat dazed in the old armchair in the living room, where Thomas used to read the newspaper every morning. In her hands were a small, rusted keychain and a slip of paper with the storage facility address, the only asset her husband of more than 40 years had left solely to her. Silence filled the house, yet in her mind echoed her son's mocking laughter. An empty storage unit? Dad really knew how to joke. Those words were like a knife twisting deeper into a wound that had not yet healed. She did not regret the money. After a lifetime as an office secretary and then a housewife, Angelina had never chased wealth. But the way Thomas divided the assets made her feel pushed to the margins of his life. The house and money, things that ensured security, he gave to the children. And to her, he tossed a run-down storage unit in a distant industrial area, a place that held things he perhaps no longer wished to remember. That night, Angelina could not sleep. She wandered through the large house, touching her husband's keepsakes. She recalled their younger years, the times he struggled at work, when she had carefully saved every dollar of her modest secretary's salary to help him through. She had believed there were no secrets between them, that she was not just a wife, but his closest companion. Now this will felt like a cruel denial of all those sacrifices. Angelina looked at herself in the mirror and saw a 64-year-old woman, aged, lonely, and now, quite literally, left with nothing. Tears slid silently down, soaking her wrinkled cheeks. She wondered whether her years of love and devotion had meant anything at all. Or in Thomas's eyes, a man who always calculated carefully, had she been merely a faint shadow, a wife who was good enough to live with, but not trusted enough to be given real, tangible security? Clutching the cold storage key tightly in her hand, she whispered into the darkness, her voice trembling with pain. Was I never important at all? 2 days after the reading of the will, the July sun in Phoenix poured fire onto the asphalt, sending waves of heat rising thick and suffocating into the air. Julia drove her old sedan, taking her mother to the address written on the paper. It was an industrial area far out on the edge of the city, where only a few sun-scorched cacti stood scattered among rows of gray, corrugated metal warehouses, silent like anonymous graves. Storage unit number 104 sat tucked away at the very end of the row, its metal door flaking with blue paint, revealing patches of rust underneath. Angelina stood before the door, her hands shaking as she slid the small key into the lock. It took a moment of fumbling before the latch finally popped open with a dry click. With Julia's help, she strained to push the heavy rolling door upward. Creak, creak, bang! The door opened, and the first thing that greeted them was not the gleam of gold or the comfort of furniture, but a thick cloud of dust that burst outward, making both mother and daughter cough violently. The smell of damp paper, old printer's ink, and stale air trapped for years rushed straight into their noses. Inside the roughly 15-square-meter unit were dozens of cardboard boxes stacked on top of one another, each sealed carefully with tape. On every box were only a few dates scribbled hastily in faded black marker. A car screeched to a stop behind them. Daniel stepped out of his shiny Mercedes. He had followed them, not out of concern for his mother, but out of instinctive curiosity. What if the old man had hidden cash here? But when Daniel saw the scene inside, his expression shifted from anticipation to disappointment and finally to outright contempt. He waved his hand in front of his face to brush away dust, stepped inside, and lightly kicked a cardboard box on the floor with the tip of his expensive leather shoe. "Wonderful," Daniel drawled, his voice thick with sarcasm. "A pile of junk paper. This is Mom's inheritance?" Angelina stood frozen, staring at the lifeless boxes of files. She did not know what to say. Could her husband's entire life truly be reduced to these old documents? Daniel turned to look at his mother, shook his head in irritation, and delivered his cold verdict. "Listen to me, Mom. Call a cleanup service to haul all this junk away, then return the unit to the landlord. Why keep this clutter? You're paying a few $100s a month just to rent this godforsaken place. That money's better saved for your retirement." Daniel's suggestion to cheaply get rid of everything to save on rent was brutally practical. To him, anything that could not be immediately converted into cash was nothing but a burden. Angelina looked at the boxes, her heart heavy. She felt as if Daniel did not just want to throw away these papers, but wanted to discard the last remaining memories of his father as well, simply because they did not generate profit. Daniel's suggestion to throw everything away hung in the suffocating air of the warehouse, but Angelina no longer seemed to hear it. She stood there, her trembling hand gently touching the yellowed tape on the nearest cardboard box. In that moment of stillness, a vivid memory of Thomas suddenly flooded back, as clear as if he were standing right beside her. Thomas Brooks had never been a careless man. He was cautious to the point of severity. Angelina remembered countless evenings when he sat at his desk, sorting every utility bill, clipping each insurance receipt into meticulously labeled folders. A man who never once tossed the wrong piece of candy wrapper into the recycling bin. Could he really have rented a storage unit for decades just to keep worthless junk? "No," Angelina whispered, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the silence. Daniel, who was pulling out his phone to look up a cleanup service, frowned and turned back. "What did you say, Mom? It's blazing hot out here. Don't make things complicated. Let me call someone to clean this up and we'll go home." "It's no," I said. Angelina spun around. Her eyes flashed with an unusual determination that made Daniel freeze. "Your father was not wasteful. He paid to rent this place year after year for a reason. I will not throw anything away until I know exactly what's inside." A powerful intuition, the intuition of a wife who had shared every breath of life with her husband, was telling her this was not trash. There was something in the neat arrangement of these boxes, in the way Thomas had hidden them away for so many years, that suggested a mystery waiting to be uncovered. Daniel let out a long sigh, his face filled with annoyance and contempt for what he considered the senility of old age. He shrugged and slipped his phone back into his pocket. "Fine, do whatever you want. If you feel like breathing dust and wasting time on this pile of junk paper, go ahead. I don't have time to play detective. Julia, you stay and take care of Mom." With that, Daniel turned his back and walked straight to his car, the slam of the door echoing coldly behind him. Inside the warehouse, only Angelina and Julia remained. Angelina looked at her daughter, then at the silent stacks of boxes in front of her. She did not know what she was searching for, a reason, an apology, or perhaps just the last remnants of her husband, but she knew she had to check everything herself. "Mom, let me help you," Julia said gently, rolling up her sleeves. Angelina nodded, took a deep breath, and began to tear off the first strip of tape. She did not know that this small action was the key that would open Pandora's box for the Brooks family. 3 hours crawled by slowly in the furnace-like heat of storage unit number 104. Julia's shirt was soaked with sweat, clinging tightly to her back, while Angelina's thin hands were smeared with black dust. The first cardboard boxes steadily drained their hope. They contained nothing but mundane items, income tax receipts from the 1990s, car repair invoices, old health insurance papers, and even stacks of medical reports documenting Thomas's heart condition. "Mom, maybe Daniel was right," Julia sighed, wiping sweat from her forehead, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "Maybe Dad just had a habit of hoarding paperwork. We're looking for a needle at the bottom of the sea." Angelina did not answer. She was pulling out a smaller box, wedged tightly beneath the bottom of the fourth large carton. Unlike the others, this box was carefully wrapped in moisture-resistant wax paper and tightly bound with sturdy nylon cord. Her heart pounding in her chest, she carefully untied the cord. Inside lay a black leather-bound notebook, its spine frayed and worn, resting atop a stack of documents clipped inside a dark blue hardcover folder. Angelina opened the first page of the notebook. Tears welled instantly when she saw the familiar, slanted, precise handwriting. It was Thomas's handwriting, but the content inside was completely foreign, nothing like the grocery lists or household expense notes she had so often seen him write at the kitchen table. May 12, 2003. First transfer completed. High risk, but my instincts tell me this is the only opportunity. This must be kept absolutely secret to ensure Angelina's and the children's safety if it fails. She flipped quickly through the following pages. Dense columns of calculations filled the notebook, along with notes about secret meetings at suburban coffee shops. Beneath the notebook were copies of old contracts, the edges of the paper yellowed with time. The bold printed title leapt out at her: Strategic Capital Contribution Agreement. Along with them were draft handwritten letters hastily written in blue ink, addressed to a lawyer named Harrison, the late predecessor of the current law firm. In those letters, Thomas's tone was sharp and decisive, completely unlike the quiet, resigned man who counted every dollar in daily life. I want clear legal ownership established. This investment is not meant for the present. It is the final reserve fund for my wife's future. Angelina's hands fell limp, the paper slipping softly onto her lap. A wave of dizziness washed over her. The husband who constantly complained about rising electricity bills, who hesitated for weeks before buying a new pair of shoes? Was this the same man who had secretly written about investments and strategy? She realized she was holding the key to a massive secret Thomas had taken him with him to the grave. Angelina's trembling hands opened the thick file clipped inside the dark blue folder, the documents buried deepest at the bottom of the metal box. Inside were not petty receipts, but a comprehensive legal dossier related to a private trust called the Brooks Trust. Attached were certificates of share ownership in a company named Apex Logistics. Angelina squinted, trying to remember. 20 years earlier, she vaguely recalled Thomas mentioning that he had lent money to an old friend to save a struggling trucking fleet on the brink of bankruptcy. At the time, she thought it was only a few $1,000s, and since Thomas never mentioned it again, she assumed the money had been lost. "Mom, let me check if this company still exists," Julia said curiously, pulling out her phone and typing the company name into the search bar. The air inside the warehouse suddenly felt thick and heavy. A few seconds later, Julia's hands began to shake uncontrollably, her face draining of color and shock. She swallowed hard and turned the phone screen toward her mother. "Mom, look at this. This isn't just a trucking fleet anymore." On the screen was the homepage of a massive multinational logistics corporation. Apex Logistics was now a giant dominating freight transportation across the American Southwest, recently listed on the stock market with explosive growth. Julia stammered, her fingers flying across a financial app. "Based on the number of shares listed in this contract and the current market price, Mom, this asset is worth nearly $50 million. Angelina froze, feeling as if the ground beneath her had collapsed. $50 million? It was an unimaginable figure, enough to buy the entire neighborhood where she lived. Her husband, the man who counted every electricity bill, who wore shirts with frayed collars, had been holding a fortune of this magnitude? But the greatest shock was still to come. Angelina turned to the final page of the trust agreement. Her eyes widened fully, her breath caught painfully in her chest. Under the line labeled Legal Owner, it was not Thomas Brooks's name. The bold, unmistakable capital letters read, sole and lawful beneficiary, Angelina Brooks. Tears spilled freely down Angelina's face. Thomas had not hidden money from her. He had hidden money for her. 20 years ago, he had transferred everything into her name, quietly building a throne to ensure that no matter what happened to him, the woman of his life would never have to bow to anyone. He had not left her an empty storage unit. He had left her an empire. News of the immense fortune hidden in storage unit number 104 reached Daniel faster than wildfire. That very evening, his sports car roared into Angelina's driveway, braking hard and leaving a black skid mark across the concrete. Completely unlike the bored, contemptuous man who had sneered at the junk warehouse 2 days earlier, Daniel entered the house brimming with agitation and a strange, feverish energy. Angelina and Julia were seated at the dining table, carefully reorganizing the financial documents. When Daniel spotted the dark blue folder on the table, his eyes lit up like a predator catching the scent of fresh blood. Without greeting anyone, he lunged forward, grabbed the folder, and flipped through the pages with hands trembling from excitement. "I can't believe it! I can't believe it!" Daniel muttered, his mouth dry as he stared at the updated valuation Julia had just printed and clipped inside. $50 million! The old man, Dad, was a genius. He looked up at his mother, his face completely transformed. The mocking smile was gone, replaced with an affection so forced it was chilling. Daniel pulled a chair closer to Angelina and took her frail hand, the same hand he had rarely touched for years. "Mom," Daniel said sweetly, his voice coated with calculation, "this is an enormous and extremely complex asset. Just look at this. Stocks, bonds, corporate income taxes. It's all very complicated. A woman who spent her life taking care of the household like you, how could you possibly deal with those shark lawyers out there?" Angelina pulled her hand back slightly, uneasy at the sudden shift. "Julia and I are learning as we go. I think I can ask Mr. No, Daniel cut in sharply, then quickly softened his tone. "Mr. Henderson is old, senile even. You need to let me handle this. I'm a businessman. I understand how money flows. Let me work with the lawyers for you. I'll make sure you get every single cent without the IRS breathing down your neck." As he spoke, Daniel swiftly gathered all the documents on the table, tucking them tightly under his arm as if afraid someone might snatch them away. "All right, I'll take these home tonight and study them carefully. You just rest, Mom. Don't worry about anything. From now on, let Daniel take care of everything." Julia frowned and tried to intervene. "Daniel, Mom hasn't agreed yet, and just yesterday you were saying we should throw all this away?" Daniel shot his sister a sharp, threatening glare, then turned back to smile broadly at their mother. "That was before I knew Dad had left such a massive burden for Mom. I'm just trying to help." In the dimly lit living room, Daniel's shadow stretched long across the wall, looming over the elderly mother sitting hunched in her chair. Angelina looked at her son, a vague sense of unease rising in her chest. She felt as though the person standing before her was no longer the little boy she once knew, but a stranger being slowly devoured by the intoxication of money. 2 weeks after taking all the documents home, Daniel completely vanished without a trace. He did not answer his mother's calls, nor did he reply to Julia's messages. That terrifying silence felt like the calm before a massive storm. In his private office, under the dim yellow light at midnight, Daniel was carrying out his guilty strokes of the pen. Scattered across the mahogany desk were drafts covered with tangled signatures. He squinted, holding an expensive fountain pen, meticulously tracing his mother's trembling handwriting from an old birthday card. Scratch, scratch. The forged signature appeared flawless. Angelina Brooks. Daniel curled his lips into a smirk, a cold smile devoid of any remaining warmth of family affection. He deluded himself. She's old. She doesn't know how to spend money. If the money stays with her, she'll just get scammed anyway. I'm doing this to protect the family's assets. This is for her own good. The next morning, Daniel drove straight to the Maricopa County Family Court. In his hand was a thick file requesting an emergency order, an application for financial conservatorship. In the petition, Daniel painted his mother as a confused elderly woman who had lost legal capacity. He shamelessly listed fabricated evidence, her renting a storage unit full of junk for years as a sign of pathological hoarding disorder, her confusion at the will reading as a symptom of early-stage dementia. He even attached a medical certification bearing a forged signature of a psychologist whom he had either bribed or entirely fabricated. 3 days later, the doorbell rang at Angelina's house. A court process server, his face cold and impassive, handed her a brown envelope stamped in red, urgent. Angelina trembled as she tore it open. Each line of text danced before her eyes, sharp and cold like knife blades. Petition to revoke asset management rights. Plaintiff, Daniel Brooks. Reason, defendant Angelina Brooks shows signs of severe cognitive decline and lacks the capacity to control a large estate. The paper slipped from her hand and fluttered down onto the cold floor. She could not believe her eyes. The son she had carried in her womb, the child she had stayed up all night caring for when he was sick, was now using the law to turn her into a madwoman in order to seize what her husband had left behind. A crushing pain seized her chest. Angelina collapsed to the ground, her choked sobs breaking through the empty house. "Daniel, how could you do this to your own mother?" When Julia rushed into the living room, she saw her mother sitting dazed on the floor, clutching the court summons as if it were a death sentence. After skimming the blatant lies in the petition, the gentle face of teacher Julia hardened, her eyes igniting with a fury she had never known. She said nothing. She helped her mother up, poured her a glass of warm water, then turned and walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" Angelina called weakly after her. "I'm going to meet the person trying to destroy this family," Julia replied curtly, her voice icy. Half an hour later, Julia kicked open the door to Daniel's luxurious real estate office. Her brother was reclining in a high-end leather chair, casually swirling a glass of liquor, wearing the triumphant expression of someone who had just closed a lucrative deal. "Hello, little sister," Daniel sneered, showing no surprise. "I figured you'd seen the court papers. Don't get worked up. I'm just taking the necessary steps to—" "Necessary steps?" Julia cut him off, her voice ringing sharply through the quiet office. She slammed a photocopied stack of the court documents onto the glossy desk. "You call fabricating Mom's mental illness and forging medical records necessary steps? You've lost your mind, Daniel. That's our mother." Daniel sighed, set down his glass, stood up, and walked around the desk with an air of condescension. He leaned in close to his sister, lowering his voice in a threatening whisper. "What do you know? You're just a lowly teacher, scraping by on a pathetic salary. Do you really think Mom can manage $50 million? That money needs cool-headed people like me to make it grow, not to rot away in the hands of a senile old woman." "Don't hide your greed behind the excuse of protecting Mom." She stared straight into his eyes, fearless. "Dad saw this coming. He knew money would corrupt you, which is why he left you nothing, and he was right." The words struck straight at Daniel's darkest nerve, making his facial muscles twitch. He snarled, "I'm saving this family from stupidity." Julia stepped back, looking at her own brother with disgust and estrangement. She pointed directly at his face and delivered her final declaration of war. "You're wrong, Daniel. You're not protecting the family. You're hunting it. And let me make this clear. I will sell my own house to hire a lawyer. I will stand beside Mom and fight you to the end. You won't get a single cent." With that, Julia turned and walked away, leaving Daniel standing alone in the cold office, the sound of her heels striking the floor like a judge's gavel beginning to count down to the coming trial. Only 2 days remained before the preliminary hearing. The atmosphere in the law office representing Angelina was taut as a drawn wire. Angelina sat curled inward, her eyes swollen from nights of relentless crying. Julia sat beside her, gripping her mother's hand tightly, her face gaunt but her gaze unwavering. Attorney Arthur Sterling, the secret trustee of the Brooks Trust, entered the room. He did not carry stacks of thick files as usual, but instead placed a small black digital recorder and a red-stamped copy of the trust charter on the table. "Mrs. Brooks, Julia," Arthur said, his voice low and heavy. "Thomas foresaw this day. He instructed me to reveal these items only if and only if someone in the family deliberately attempted to dispute or harm you." He pressed play. The silence was torn apart by static, followed by Daniel's harsh voice, clear and unmistakable. It was a recording from 6 months before Thomas's death, inside his hospital room. "Stop being stubborn, Dad. You're about to die. What the hell are you keeping the money for?" Daniel shouted angrily. "That money is your mother's." Thomas's voice was weak, broken by heart pain. "She doesn't know anything. Transfer the power of attorney to me right now. If you don't sign, don't expect me to show my face at your funeral." Angelina covered her mouth, tears streaming uncontrollably. She had never known about this conversation. She had always thought her son was merely busy, never imagining he had brutally cornered his own father like this on his deathbed. The raw truth shattered a mother's heart. Arthur stopped the recording, leaving a chilling silence behind. He slid the trust charter toward Julia. "Thomas knew Daniel wouldn't stop," Arthur continued firmly, "so he embedded a legal trap in the trust agreement." He pointed to Clause 12, Section B, printed in bold, "Permanent Disinheritance Clause. Any potential beneficiary who engages in threats, coercion, deception, or fraudulent legal actions to seize control of assets from the primary beneficiary, Angelina Brooks, shall immediately forfeit all inheritance rights, including any assets previously allocated." Julia finished reading and looked up at the lawyer, her eyes wide with shock. "So that means," she stammered. "It means," Arthur nodded, "that Daniel's act of filing for conservatorship and forging medical documents triggered this clause. He didn't just fail to steal his mother's money, he personally signed his own sentence of disinheritance. Thomas set the snare, and Daniel walked into it, blinded by greed." On Monday morning, courtroom number 3 of the Maricopa County Superior Court was suffocating with tension. Daniel entered in a perfectly tailored Italian suit, head held high, exuding the confidence of someone certain of victory. He believed that with his smooth rhetoric and complete medical file, declaring his mother legally incompetent would be nothing more than a formality. Standing at the witness stand, Daniel performed flawlessly as a grieving, devoted son. "Your Honor," his voice lowered with practiced concern, "I'm only doing this to protect my mother. She's confused now, no longer clear-minded enough to safeguard my father's legacy." Judge Harrison, a stern woman wearing horn-rimmed glasses, listened silently, then turned to attorney Arthur Sterling. "Does the defense have anything to add?" Arthur rose slowly, straightening his tie. Without heated argument, he stepped forward and submitted a thin folder and a USB drive to the court clerk. "Your Honor, we do not object with words, we object with facts." The hospital argument recording was played. The courtroom fell completely silent. Daniel's cruel, greedy, and unfilial words echoed through the room, shredding the mask of the dutiful son he had just so carefully constructed. Daniel's face drained of color, his hands gripping the railing as sweat began to bead on his forehead. But the killing blow was yet to come. And here, Arthur raised the medical evaluation Daniel had submitted, we have summoned Dr. Roberts, whose name appears on this signature. The courtroom door opened. An elderly doctor stepped in and stated clearly before the court, "I have never examined Mrs. Angelina Brooks. This signature is forged." Judge Harrison's gavel came down with a sharp bang, making Daniel flinch violently. Her gaze fixed on him now held nothing but legal contempt and severity. "Daniel Brooks," the judge said coldly, "you have not only wasted this court's time, but committed offenses that are intolerable. Forging medical documents and lying to the court in an attempt to seize property are serious crimes." Daniel stood frozen, his legs trembling as if about to collapse. He stammered, trying to defend himself, but his own attorney shook his head, packed his briefcase, and signaled that it was over. The court denies all conservatorship requests by the plaintiff. Furthermore, this case file will be referred to the district attorney for potential criminal prosecution on charges of forgery and fraud. Angelina sat in the back row, watching her son completely unravel before the bench. She felt no satisfaction, only a profound sorrow rising in her chest. Greed had not only stripped Daniel of his character, now it was stripping him of his freedom and his future as well. The sound of Judge Harrison's gavel had barely faded, but Daniel Brooks's nightmare was only just truly beginning. As he staggered toward the courtroom exit, hoping to salvage the last scraps of his dignity, attorney Arthur Sterling stepped directly into his path, his expression cold yet tinged with unmistakable pity. "Hold on a moment, Daniel," Arthur said calmly, his voice steady but carrying the weight of 1,000 pounds. "We're not finished yet." Daniel lifted his bloodshot eyes and snarled, "What else do you want? I've already lost the case. I'll withdraw the petition. My mother wins, all right?" Arthur shook his head, reached into his briefcase, and pulled out another legal document, placing it squarely into Daniel's trembling hands. "You didn't just lose the conservatorship case," Arthur said evenly. "Read carefully the terms of the Brooks Trust that I mentioned earlier. Your fraudulent conduct before the court and the forged signatures today have officially triggered the permanent disinheritance clause." Daniel snatched the paper, his hands shaking violently. "This means," Arthur emphasized each word, "that the entire portion of assets Thomas intended to leave to you, including 50% of the current house's value and the liquid cash savings, has now been revoked. You will not receive a single dollar from the Brooks family estate. You are completely penniless, Daniel." Daniel's mouth fell open as the document slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the ground. "No, that's impossible. That money is mine. Dad couldn't do this to me." He screamed in despair, but the only response was the icy gaze of those standing nearby. And it did not stop there. The moment Daniel stumbled out of the courthouse doors, 2 police officers and a representative from the Arizona Association of Realtors were already waiting. "Daniel Brooks," one officer stepped forward, "we have an order requiring you to come with us for questioning regarding document forgery and false declarations to government authorities." The association representative delivered the final crushing blow. "And, Mr. Brooks, due to the serious ethical violations involved in this case, your real estate broker's license is hereby suspended indefinitely, effective immediately pending investigation. All of your current transactions are frozen." Daniel stood motionless on the courthouse steps under the blazing sun. Within the span of a single hour, the arrogant, successful businessman had lost everything: his money, his reputation, his career, and his family. He looked into the distance, where his mother's and sister's car was slowly driving away, leaving him utterly alone with the greed that had sentenced him by his own hand. That afternoon, the suburban house was strangely quiet, the stillness that follows a violent storm. There were no more of Daniel's arguments, no more threatening calls from lawyers. Only the steady ticking of the wall clock remained, and the long rays of the setting sun stretching across the wooden floor. Angelina sat at the dining table. In front of her lay a thick stack of documents detailing the enormous fortune that was now entirely under her control. The figure of $50 million on paper no longer felt overwhelming. It felt heavy, like a massive stone. To protect it, she had watched her family fall apart and seen the son she loved dragged into legal ruin. She softly called Julia to come closer. Her daughter sat down across from her, her eyes still shadowed with sadness from the dramatic court hearing. Angelina pushed half of the documents toward her daughter, her voice trembling but resolute. "Julia, I'm old now. I don't need that much money to live out the rest of my life. I've lived simply my entire life. This fortune is too large, and keeping it safe was because of you. I've decided to transfer 50% of the shares and assets to you immediately. Take it as a gift from your father and me." The room fell silent for a beat. Julia stared at the stack of papers worth tens of millions of dollars, the same money her brother had sold his conscience to fight for, the money that could allow her to retire instantly and live in comfort for the rest of her life. Then, gently, Julia pushed the documents back toward her mother. She shook her head as tears streamed down her cheeks. "I won't take it, Mom," Julia said, her voice choked but firm. Angelina was stunned. "Why not? You deserve it. You're nothing like your brother." "Exactly because I don't want to become like him," Julia said, gripping her mother's hand tightly. "You've endured enough. This battle has cost you too many tears. I have a job. I have my small home. I already have enough." She took a deep breath, lifted her eyes to Thomas's portrait hanging on the wall, then turned back to her mother, her gaze glowing with kindness. "Dad started with nothing. He was lucky to have people who helped him and to have you by his side through every hardship. That's how he built everything. I don't want this money to exist only for our selfish comfort. I want you to use it to help people who never had the chances Dad once had. That's the best way to honor his legacy." Angelina stared at her daughter in stunned silence. In that moment, she realized Julia had inherited not only her gentle eyes, but Thomas's compassionate heart and far-reaching vision. She smiled, the lightest smile she had worn since his passing, and nodded through her tears. 1 year after the family storm, Angelina Brooks's life had turned to an entirely new page. There were no luxury vacations, no seaside mansions, no extravagant jewelry people usually imagine when speaking of a newly revealed millionaire. Instead, every dividend and asset from the Brooks Trust had been redirected toward a different purpose. Angelina did exactly as her daughter had suggested. She established the Brooks Foundation Scholarship Fund, a nonprofit organization dedicated to funding tuition and startup opportunities for underprivileged yet determined students, just like Thomas had once been. The first scholarship ceremony was held in the grand auditorium of Arizona State University. Warm golden stage lights illuminated young faces filled with innocence and hope. Angelina stood at the podium, her silver hair neatly pinned, her face radiating a rare serenity and kindness, a presence money could never buy, born only from peace of the soul. Standing beside her was Julia, her eyes shining with pride. She watched her mother hand out each scholarship, offering each handshake and word of encouragement to children who were once strangers. Daniel was nowhere to be seen. Occasional news of her brother, recently released from a suspended sentence and struggling to rebuild his life from nothing, still reached them from time to time, but it had become only a minor, somber note in a life that had moved forward. As the applause filled the hall and the ceremony drew to a close, the crowd slowly dispersed. Angelina lingered on the stage a moment longer. She turned to look at the large backdrop behind her. There, a black and white portrait of Thomas Brooks smiled gently. His eyes seemed to look straight at her, warm, trusting. She stepped closer and lifted her wrinkled hand to softly touch her late husband's face. In that sacred, silent moment, she finally understood all of his deeper intentions. He hid the money not because he didn't trust her, but because he wanted to use it as one final test, a test to filter out greed and preserve the truest values for their family. Angelina smiled faintly and whispered to the portrait, her voice trembling yet filled with love. "My love, you didn't leave me money in the usual way. You left me the truth and a great lesson for our children." She turned and took Julia's hand. Mother and daughter supported each other as they walked down the steps, moving toward the brilliant light at the auditorium doors. Behind them, Thomas's smile seemed to glow even brighter. The screen slowly fades to black. In the end, the greatest inheritance was never money. It was trust. It was restraint. It was the courage to choose compassion over entitlement. Some parents leave wealth behind, others leave wisdom, and the rarest ones leave a final lesson powerful enough to protect their family even after they're gone. Greed always demands more, but love knows when enough is enough. Now I want to ask you, if you were Angelina, would you have made the same choice? Do you believe parents should leave everything to their children or test them first? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the most valuable legacy is the conversation we're brave enough to have.